I'd like to introduce our next speaker. If you were here early, you saw him on stage earlier, Patrick Campos. He is here to speak about decentralized truth, applying the Catholic principles of solidarity and subsidiarity to blockchain technology. Now, blockchain technology and its most well-recognized progeny, cryptocurrencies, have proliferated with a subculture that champions decentralization as a source of freedom. The timeless teachings of the Church on the true purpose and fulfillment of human freedom are manifested societally in the concepts of solidarity and subsidiarity. Subsidiarity implies the sort of decentralization proposed by the crypto community, but it is the proper understanding of solidarity with its laser focus on the inherent God-given dignity of the individual human being as the object of our societal obligations that informs decentralization in a way that does not lead inevitably to selfish mischief, crime, and exploitation. This is why we need to begin the conversation. Patrick Campos will explore this proper balance prescribed by the Church for the right ordering of society as it relates to blockchain and other technologies. A resident of Dubai, Patrick has devoted the past 5 years to blockchain, serving as Chief Strategy Officer for Securrency, a blockchain-based and institutional-grade financial markets organization. Patrick oversees matters ranging from corporate development, capital strategy, and business development to government relationships, marketing, and communications. Now, some other titles that Patrick's held professionally include entrepreneur, lawyer, U.S. Marine Corps officer, as you heard earlier. In the UAE, Patrick, his wife, and friends started a tackle football league. As a catechist over the past 12 years, Patrick has prepared more than 500 young men and women for the sacrament of confirmation at St. Francis Jebel Ali in the UAE. And his most cherished roles are that of husband and father. So please welcome again to the stage, Patrick Campos.
So it was interesting to kind of hear the blurb repeated back in the wake of the FTX thing, mischief. So first of all, as I get started here, just sound a note of humility. Often when I'm speaking, I may be in a room where I have a little bit more knowledge of the technology than the audience. Sometimes I'm in rooms where I have a little bit more of a grasp on philosophy or maybe even some metaphysical matters. I feel like in this crowd, I'm like, bottom quartile in every one of those categories. So as I go through this, I'm not professing a particular expertise in any one of those things. And, just listening to Dr. Abella's presentation a moment ago just sort of reinforced that. It is with that spirit of humility that I'm kind of addressing this topic, and I think it's an important one. And in the earlier panel discussion, we talked a bit about, I guess it came off as gloomy. It is what it is, but we talked about, sort of these, this sort of move toward a kind of a globalization. And the response toward this kind of more, decentralized, society. And it's exactly, what we're talking about here are the two extremes of these concepts, these very Catholic concepts of solidarity and subsidiarity. And to begin, obviously, these concepts take their root as articulated by, Saint Pope John Paul the Great. They take the crux is obviously the human being, and specifically the inherent dignity of the human being. And with that as a starting point, these pillars are human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity. So let's just break those down. And again, I know that pretty much everyone in this room is very familiar with these concepts. And so if I'm coming across as being pedantic, I'll apologize in advance for that. But solidarity. If we think about it this way, I like to take this kind of an approach to it. And if I think with the human being at the center, and we think of the great gifts, the two great gifts that God has given. There's a third, of course, but the two great gifts that God has given man right? One is this free will, this, almost, deified sense of reason, but combined with free will. On the other hand, the capacity to love. And I think that those two things, the third, of course, being the ability to create on behalf of God, procreation as well. But if I take those two and I can apply them, I can say, well, on the one side, this principle of solidarity embodies this gift of love. It is the outward expression of this gift of love. And on the other side, subsidiarity is the expression, the societal expression of this gift of free will. And so if we think about it that way, we realize that, the two must go hand in glove. But what we find is all too often, as things play out in society, we go to one extreme or the other. And if I think about, kind of on the side of, if we go to the extreme of subsidiarity, we end up in, kind of an amoral libertarian world. And I think that, regardless of where one places themselves on the political, or the philosophical spectrum, I think it's certainly true that we have seen, for example, on the American political right, over the course of the last, say, quarter century, maybe more, this really just, almost religious, fetishization, if you will, of capitalism. Now, I'm an unabashed capitalist, but the idea that it is a good unto itself is a distortion of the principle of subsidiarity, and untethered from the love that forms the other side of the spectrum. You get not only bad results, but it actually turns out to be a pretty poor political recipe as well. On the other side, the extreme expression of solidarity is, of course, totalitarianism, and the actual, almost erasure of the individual human being, along with that human being's dignity, and so again, untethered. It may begin, as I was expressing earlier, it may begin from a good sort of altruistic moral purpose, but untethered from that respect for individual human freedom. As they say, good intentions pave the road to hell. And so as we look at, for example, and I was, I guess, frightening everybody, with my sense of the globalist movement and sort of, what is in store. And again, not because I'm fantasizing about this, but because I'm reading what they're actually saying. These are the things that we're going to do, and I realize that once you untether it from that respect for individual human freedom, it can only go in one direction. It always does. And so, as we think about that application, societally, the church in her wisdom, has recognized that these two things, they don't exist separately. They exist together, both to uphold that core principle, that foundational principle of individual human dignity, that God-given human dignity. And so, when we look at, and I was just having an interesting conversation with a couple of gentlemen here, and you can see these things being played out really in this blockchain and crypto world, where there are voices, and I would call them sort of the let's call them crypto maximalists or decentralization maximalists, who really say there should be zero regulation, there should be zero centralization. And then on the other hand, you have folks who are looking at the blockchain and saying, this is a fantastic tool for really controlling populations and achieving results that a few smart people can direct because the vast majority of human beings are kind of messy. And so both things are possible with this technology. And you know, what we've seen is, and there are many theories about you know, what we're really seeing with this whole FTX thing, and I think that you know, I used the analogy of a play earlier. I think we're like at the very beginning of the first act of that. There's a lot more to unfold there. So I don't want to go too far into that rabbit hole, but I think, you know, there's a point there as we look at it and we say, well, you know, here it is sort of on display, an individual operating in a decentralized, unregulated world, claiming that the whole purpose of his business activities is to implement this philosophy that he espouses called effective altruism, make a lot of money and give most of it away. And yet, when we look at the business practices, and again, just at a surface level, if we take everything just sort of, you know, as it appears at surface level, what we see is a callous disregard for the individuals whose money was in the custody of these individuals. So that you look at that and you say, well, I'm in solidarity with the world and I'm going to give to charity, but I don't even love the individuals who have actually entrusted me with their money enough to be a good steward. And so, you know, it's amazing. Obviously, as I, you know, sort of prepared for this presentation, none of that had happened. And in fact, I think for most of us, myself included, none of it was actually even imaginable. But it did. And it sparked, you know, again, these same debates to centralize or to decentralize, solidarity, subsidiarity. And what we find is, you know, it's not just played out in the technology space. We're not, you know, one of the reasons that I love what I do, and I say this frequently, is that I work with a company that's engaged in developing and purveying financial technology. So we're in the technology space, we're in the financial services space, but really, because of the nature of blockchain technology, what I really love is that we are actually engaged in some of the deepest and most meaningful conversations that can be had. I did a presentation recently where I juxtaposed two pictures, you know, one a room full of central bankers, and this is who used to talk about monetary policy, and over on the other side was a kid in a hoodie. This is who's talking about monetary policy right now. We're having these discussions about, you know, what is the very meaning of money? Now, you know, I've gone around the sun, you know, more than 50 times, and I can tell you that that was not a common conversation up until about, you know, a decade ago, right? It was not a common conversation that you would have with your friends. Hey, tell me, you know, what is this thing? What is the very meaning of money? What does it mean to be a fiat currency? But everybody's talking about it now, and along with that, it's triggering some deeply philosophical discussions. And I think what's missing, and one of the reasons why when Matt asked me, you know, if I'd be interested in participating, is because in this group and in this forum is the missing ingredient. These discussions are happening in this sort of secular, amoral context where we're going to end up on one side or on the other. And I really do believe that, you know, we as Catholics are uniquely positioned and perhaps uniquely called to provide that missing ingredient to the discussion, where this can go in all kinds of crazy directions. You know, one of the lines of discussion earlier was about, well, if this is really happening, how do we all just unplug? How do we go off the grid? how do we take subsidiarity to its extreme? And then there are others who are like, well, how bad could it be? It's going to be a super convenient world. And aren't we saving the planet in the process? Isn't this all really good in taking solidarity to its extreme? But I think when we look at that type of solidarity, what we see is false gods. It's a solidarity and a message that's driven by a false god. And I'll say to people all the time when I teach my class, why do we think that environmentalism is something new? Environmentalism is just, being good to your neighbor. It's a Christian message that goes back 2,000 years. But what's happened is we've said, well, no, we were going to replace it with be good to the earth. And, it strikes me that the only thing that's particularly interesting about this rock is the fact that human beings with God-given dignity reside on it. And if you lose sight of that, and we say, no, actually, these human beings are an infestation, they're actually a pollutant, then your application of this principle of solidarity begins to be warped. And we can go deep down that rabbit hole, which I'm happy to have a discussion offline about that. But that is, again, it's losing that core guiding principle. At the same time, on the other side, if we say, well, I'm going to go, hole up in my, in my panic room up in Montana, and, me and my family, and we'll just go completely off the grid. We also lose sight. I mean, the principle of subsidiarity, has to be rooted, again, in that core guiding principle of human dignity that actually does find its expression in solidarity. I think, and I'm actually going to do something that I hadn't planned. I'm going to actually recite a poem or a meditation, that's familiar to everybody, right? But it struck me, this was something, when I read this, I don't know, decades ago for the first time. This is John Donne's Meditation 17, right? I was struck by, how powerful it is as an ordering principle, right? It is the principle around which any concept of solidarity should be rooted, right? So John Donne, of course, says, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a part of the continent, a piece of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind. And then, of course, the famous end line, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. That is the most pure, clean expression of the very purpose of solidarity, in my view. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. And so if we then take that same principle and then we say that freedom, every man's freedom and free will, which is God-given, is also important to me, we're starting to strike that balance. And I think, the purpose of, my discussion here in talking about the application of those principles to, to blockchain is that blockchain technology is really bubbling these issues up to the forefront. It's not as if these political movements weren't happening before. It's not as if people weren't, haven't been talking about, utopian visions for ages. It's not as if people haven't been talking about, sort of anarchic societies for ages. These conversations have happened. But they could, to a large extent, not always, because we've seen, the scourge of totalitarianism in all of its ugly forms, but to a certain extent, it was easier to kind of, have background discussions. This technology, which has its initial application in the financial world, in the world in which, we transact and interact with each other on a day-to-day basis, in the world of commerce, something we cannot escape, something that is a feature, a permanent feature of our daily lives and our daily interactions, The fact that it's come up now, that this technology, really exposes the two extremes and the possibilities and pitfalls of either pathway, I think creates a unique moment for us as Catholics, and for us as human beings, to really get involved in the conversation and help to shape and guide the direction of this technology in a meaningful way. We talk about, as we dig deeper into things, solidarity, and we say, well, we are one church, the body of Christ. But as John Donne says, we are also involved in mankind. And then we take it even further. We are, a community. We believe in the communion of saints. Solidarity, beyond, this temporal plane. And so we know that to be true. But then we also know that the core ordering unit of the human society is, of course, the family. As reflected in, the blessed family, Mary, Joseph, and of course, Jesus. And so we see, that in our very theology, we've actually, in some ways, been prepared for this moment if we know how to, execute against that mission. And so, those were my thoughts as I started putting this together. And I didn't want to turn this into a super deep technological discussion. We can certainly talk about, the decentralization and whether, I have the view that everything should be on public ledgers or do private permission ledgers that are going to be used by institutions or are being used by institutions, do those things kind of break down the decentralization? We can have that conversation, but that really wasn't the purpose of this discussion. I actually thought of this as a bit of a call to action more than anything else. I don't think that I'm teaching anyone anything new, either about theology or about philosophy or about economics. But I am saying that at this moment, those things have become squarely a part of the public discourse across all sectors. And we need to inject that voice that is centered on the dignity of the individual human being and that God-given dignity as an ordering principle around which we deploy and operate in this new technological age. So I was given 50 minutes, and I'm going to give you the option of either just asking questions or getting some time back because, well, everybody would like a cup of coffee, I'm sure, but I'm happy to take questions.
Caught me a little off guard.
So I'm glad you brought up this issue of the FTX scandal. And so there you have this interesting combination of a basically secular religion with finance. And so, if we as Catholics are honest with ourselves, Catholicism has a long history of financial corruption, going from buying penthouse apartments in London recently to Judas. I mean, it's everywhere.
That's right.
And so, from my perspective, and it ties in with the solidarity and subsidiarity, it seems to me that there's a real opportunity for the Catholic Church to take a leadership position in how how my donation is getting spent. How can we potentially use blockchain to introduce transparency into these altruistic organizations? I mean, the Catholic Church is the biggest organization of that type, arguably. And so what would you do if somebody said, how can we use blockchain to reduce financial scandal in the Catholic Church?
Well, first of all, as they say, sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? And one of the things about a distributed ledger is that it's very transparent. Well, you can actually see everything. You know, if you look at, you know, sort of the Bitcoin ledger or any other public ledger, you know, it's a series of addresses. I mean, I can see what's happening. I can't necessarily associate that address with an individual. But, you know, in an organizational sense, where you can see that money moving. So a good example of this is, you know, we did a project not too long ago with, it was this sort of pilot project with the World Bank. And, you know, the concept was traceable loans, right? So the World Bank makes these loans, and let's say, you know, they say, oh, you know, we're going to administer inoculations in a country in Africa. And then there's a whole series of middlemen, these middle companies, you know, all through that supply chain, who are, you know, taking their cut from this money as they provide certain things. Everyone knows, this is you know, not a secret. Everyone knows there's massive amounts of leakage in that process. And so you could take, what we could do is actually using blockchain is we could create both the payment that was traceable throughout and an automated mechanism for a certification that a particular service had been performed. So there had to be a certification, a verification agent who certifies that, you know, let's say all the way down to the individual shot. That inoculation was actually administered to a child in this country. And then that would trigger sort of a waterfall of payments, and you could see it all, right? And I used to joke that it probably destroyed a lot of Mercedes-Benz dealerships in these countries. You know, but that's, you know, that's an example of how the transparency and the immutability of the blockchain can help to sort that out. As I've been saying, though, the flip side of that is that, you know, you have to sort of attach names. And when you start attaching names to addresses, it also becomes a massive surveillance tool. But used properly in that sort of an institutional context, I think it can be tremendously useful. But I'm going to tie this back to the main theme as well, because I think the macro issue here is, again, you know, something that we talked about earlier. Any kind of a concentration of that kind of power, right? You know, you have this accumulation of wealth pouring in from all over the world and centralized. It's too much temptation. You know, it really is. And so the principle of subsidiarity, I think, was actually rooted to a certain extent also in this recognition that, you know, centralization of power, you know, leads to that kind of corruption. You know, I always tell my kids, you know, when I teach them in catechism, I say, you know, the devil, you know, I use a diagram. I put up like 4 boxes, and I'll say none of them have, you know, spent any time in the military. And I'll say, okay, these are 3 infantry battalions, and that's a headquarters battalion. You have 1 bomb, you can destroy any one of those boxes, but only 1. And they go, oh, headquarters battalion, right? Why? Well, because obviously they can't be led. Do you think the devil doesn't know that, right? And so you know, this sort of concentration of power, I think, is also, you know, at root. To blame as well, and so that's another aspect of it. But yeah, I mean, just the transparency of the ledger, I think, is going to be helpful in that regard. I've bloviated enough on that question, I think. So I'll take another one. Yes.
What are some concrete ways Catholics can sort of link up solidarity with subsidiarity when all the political oxygen in the room is either radical libertarianism or the progressive with totalitarian impulses? How can Catholics really be on the scene and bringing truth to bear on this discussion?
All right, so at a very superficial level, I could say, well, like this, right? What we're doing here is an excellent starting point. There is no answer to it, but the way that I'm going to attempt to address your question is going to put me on a little bit of thin ice here, and let me see if I can navigate this skillfully. I think within our own individual sort of, you know, economic organizations, the company that I work for example, you know, everyone talks about, you know, these are our company values. This is, you know, I think company values, tend to never be worth the paper that they're written on. But how do you actually apply those things, right? And the reason I say that I'm gonna tread on thin ice is because what I would say, the corporatist globalists, if you will, have really, really perfected this. I mean, if you look at ESG is an outsourcing of public policy to the private sector. It's massively successful, massively successful. Every company has, ESG policies. What are those? It's setting public policy around the democratic process and enforcing it through the economic system, right? So I want to be really careful when I say, treading on thin ice, we have to live our values, but I think that attempting to impose our values through the economic system is also a dangerous thing. And so how do we do it? Well, I mean, I think as a starting point, if you can imbue a culture of, boil it down to the basics, what is right or wrong, right? And there are simple things, we could do this deal and screw our early shareholders. That kind of a decision for, any early stage company happens all the time. And you got to stop and think about that. But I don't think that there's a systemic way to do it. And I'm going to be really cheesy and say, I'll push it down to that principle of subsidiarity that, if we individually, number one, live those values, and sometimes living those values means, beating a noisy exit. I'm not going to be a part of this. That could be applied as we talk about, let's say, some sort of a crypto scheme, right? Maybe it didn't start off that way, but I begin to recognize this looks like a crazy Ponzi scheme, and a lot of people are going to get it. You ever notice, like, everyone talks about all the money that was lost, right? But there's very little discussion about, often there's another side of that deal where money was made. Where is that, right? And so I think, sometimes it can be something like that. Other times it can be, thinking really long and hard about, is this tool, the government wants to, enter into a contract. Is this a tool I really want to put in the hands of the government? And we can take a shortcut and say, well, if I don't do it, somebody else will do it, and they're going to make money. That's the lazy way out. That's the morally lazy way out. I mean, I think, we do have to sort of have the courage of our convictions. And you can go down a rabbit hole here, because you can end up in a place where you go, well, hang on a second, because if we're just taking ourselves out of, we're just making moral decisions that take us out of the economic, cycle here, then aren't we just marginalizing ourselves and diminishing our voices even further? Yeah, I mean, these are not easy questions to answer. But I do think, as a starting point, we shouldn't be ashamed to say it. I mean, I'm sorry, but I don't know how and when it became impolite to, say, hey, I believe in certain eternal moral truths, and those are objective truths, and I think that we should all live by those. Yeah, that shouldn't be impolite to say. I'm happy to hear your contrary opinion, but I don't agree with you. But we've done that. We've sort of, I say all the time, my least favorite expression in the world is, it's not personal, it's business. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that I can have a different set of morals that I bring into the business world and to my commercial activities than I have for my own personal activities? That makes no sense, right? So, I think that's probably where it is. It's kind of being, it's a bad choice of words probably, but loud and proud, right? I wish I had a better answer, but it's not easy.
Patrick, thanks for the talk. Kirk David Phillips. You just mentioned earlier, public blockchains versus permissioned private consortium blockchains, and we didn't have time for that discussion, but now since we have so much time, we'll love your insight on that one, because I spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about that. Whereas I think of Bitcoin as the immutability layer, the immutability layer, which I don't think most people even think of it as that. They talk about store of value and these other things. But I think that's the value proposition. So I see that as a stake in the sand upon which all the other blockchains could be compared. And so I guess the question is, just from from a fraud perspective, et cetera, with these consortium blockchains having a central administrator, is it like just one hop or one derivative away from the same thing that we have now? Or is it maybe a few derivatives away from Bitcoin on the other end of the spectrum? Just curious, anything you can provide on your insight on that, would love to hear it.
Yeah, so another excellent question, and another one that's kind of like, how long is a piece of string, right? So it depends on the application. So I'll say this, so stepping outside of the kind of the moral dimension, just talking, practically here. I'm not a blockchain maximalist per se. I may kind of, to use a British expression, horses for courses kind of guy, right? And I think that, the idea that, we need a DLT for everything, I think is probably a bit limiting. Likewise, I think that there's a time and a place for a public ledger, and there's a time and a place for a permission blockchain. I hear your point loud and clear, though. It's true that if we just have this sort of series of private permission ledgers at the institutional level, that haven't we just kind of recreated the silos? And I think there's a very good argument to be made that yes, that's the case. We, as a company, have really focused on interoperability, and so we can take, I think, a little bit more of a matrix type view of how that can look. So I'll give you an example. In the discussion of CBDC and stablecoin, I will probably offend people in the room and probably offend some very good friends of mine in the industry by saying I'm not sure that you can have a fractional reserve stablecoin without regulation in the long run, right? And I just don't think you can. I think it's again, something's going to go wrong. But if we move aside from that discussion, and we say, let's just think about a pure fiat-backed, one-to-one fiat-backed, bank-issued token, right? Which is why I think taxonomy is important. I could have one for, here's Bank of America and here's Wells Fargo and so on and so forth. And as long as those things are those could be maintained, on their private ledgers. But as long as they're interoperable and I can move it onto, onto another ledger, effectively what I have is a set of digital cashier's checks, right? And so what becomes important is not necessarily the native ledger for any of those tokens. What becomes important is that piece in the middle, that interoperability piece. And then you get into some thorny technical questions about bridging and things like that. We don't do that. We actually, use a layer 3 solution. I'm not going to bore you with that. But in that sense, I'm not too fussed about whether a bank will use a private permission ledger for that purpose or not. At a macro level, right, do I personally want to see public permissionless ledgers with value that individual human beings can access? 100%. Absolutely I do. But I think that, hopefully those things can coexist with more sort of institutional models as well.
How are we on time, Patrick?
13:03.
Oh, we're
So
good.
we've got some time.
We have a question over here.
So clearly I'm in a room of early adapters, and I work for the church and primarily with the elderly and with the poor. What's going to happen in 5 years, 6 years, where we continue this process? Bitcoin is at $60,000, and our society is switching to more of the blockchain, more of the cryptocurrency, that the rest of our communities aren't ready or even knowledgeable on how to adapt, how to change. Is it going to leave mom and pop companies behind? Are the poor going to get poorer? How do we move forward?
Really great question. So, when we talk about adoption, I always think of it in sort of along two main themes, right? One is balance, and the other is abstraction. I'm actually going to focus on the latter because I've spoken a lot here on the former, right? This idea of balance, right? Balance between freedom and let's call it responsibility. If regulation done properly is an expression of responsibility. I did want to add, before I get to the abstraction part, that it's interesting because if you look at sort of the writings of Saint Pope John Paul II or Pope Benedict XVI, they will say things like the government actually should only have primacy over subsidiary authorities to the extent that those subsidiary authorities can't accomplish that societal good. And again, I'll focus on that human dignity. So anyway, balance is critical to making sure that what you're adopting is actually fit for purpose. But I'm going to focus on the abstraction part of it. This is really, really key. We in the technology space like to walk around and throw these these big words around, and it's kind of like we have our own little cool kids club, where we can throw these words around and all look really cool. Well, that's actually debilitating when it comes to engaging with policymakers, when it comes to engaging with regulators, and when it comes to engaging with mom and pop on the street. And you're absolutely right. I think that a lot of we're still in these early stages where it still feels kind of you got to have a pilot's license to operate a wallet sometimes, right? So in the end, abstracting away that complexity, both in the language, right? No one actually needs to know how the internet works. They just go, I'm going to go Google something, right? There's a whole bunch of technology behind all of that and how the internet works. It's all abstracted away. You just Google something, you enter a term, and you get a result, right? And so we have to abstract away the complexity of the language, but also abstract away the complexity of the technology. And it's already beginning to happen, right? So and I was joking about this the other day because everyone said that grandma would never give up her paper checks, and yet here she is with her banking app, and we know that happens, right? And so the same thing will happen here. It'll become easier and easier and easier to operate. It'll become ubiquitous, right? And so, but that's right. This is currently a little bit of an obstacle to to progress or to adoption, I should say. But I think that's the way that I think about it. I think making it more sort of psychologically accessible. There's another element to that as well. It's there's this sort of fear, and I think it's a well-founded fear. I'd still rather have my cash in my pocket, and there's a whole segment of society that is going to be very wary of not feeling like they're really in control of that cash. And, can you do that with a ledger or a Trezor or something like that? Yeah, you can. But then that becomes a little bit clunky too, right? How you transact with that. And maybe that's where some of this abstraction will come in, that process will become easier as well. But that's how I think about it. I just think that it's a natural, trajectory of any new technology. It's cumbersome, and then it becomes more accessible through abstraction.
Hey there. Earlier you were speaking to hoping for a sort of balance between solidarity and subsidiarity. But I'm curious, subsidiarity, like Synthesius Annus, it's all about putting the control into the individual at the lowest level, and only giving it to a higher level if that's necessary.
Right.
And I feel like an argument can be made for DeFi that we don't necessarily need much higher levels of control. And I'm wondering, can we have, as Catholics, do you think it's a stable position to embrace DeFi that's very subsidiarity to the extreme perhaps, but then think about solidarity being embodied and brought to life through more maybe the individuals or associations or others, not necessarily in the money space?
Yeah, wonderful question. Okay, so you can probably tell I ponder these kinds of things. Here's how I would address it, right? So we think about DeFi and we go, hey, what if it's just the code, right? And the code it's just objective, right? And so there isn't a human being meddling in all. Well, it's not exactly true. If we're really being honest with ourselves, right? Deus ex machina, right? Someone wrote the code. The code is always parameterized. And I was talking about this in the context with some of my students of this. The question comes up of what is the church's teaching on the Big Bang? It's kind of a lengthy conversation. I love to have that conversation. But as part of it, I was talking about this kind of fine-tuning principle where people realize that actually the conditions that permit us to be here today require such a fine set of parameters that it's not likely to have been accidental, and then people start to muse about multiverses and all this other stuff to try to explain that away. But this is the point, right? It's contrary to this view, that there's this this great kind of watchmaker in the sky who just wound it up and walked away. We know that God continues to be engaged and involved and present in the world. I actually think of DeFi the same way. I don't think you can get away from the coders. And you see this all the time, right? I think it's and again, some of my colleagues and some of my industry peers are probably going to club me over the head if they see this recording. But I don't think that it's true that someone can just wind it up and walk away. Now you say, well, what about Bitcoin? Isn't that exactly what happened? Bitcoin was just kind of a wind it up and walk away. Yeah, and then there was like Bitcoin Cash, and there's this over here, and there's all sorts of other stuff that happens, right? So and more importantly, Bitcoin is not DeFi, right? DeFi is actually now, we're actually talking about automating, transactions and rules for those transactions as among, multiple individuals. So I always think it's going to be kind of parameterized, and I always think that, there's going to be some human in the loop. But even if I don't think so, and even if someone disagrees with me, I can tell you who does think that, and that's regulators. So, I don't see us entering a world in which regulators say, there's no neck for me to wring here. It's just code. I get it. What can I do, right? They're always going to find a neck to wring. And so, so what ends up happening is the coders say, well, I just wrote an algorithm. I just wrote it and deployed it, and leave me alone. Okay, so somebody lost $10 million. And it's fashionable now. You just send a tweet. Oh, my bad, right? So I don't think that DeFi is going to eliminate these issues, these moral issues. I think DeFi goes a long way toward upholding this principle of subsidiarity. But we then have to apply the principle of solidarity to making sure that not only is the code doing what it's supposed to do, but that there is someone taking responsibility for it. There always must be, I think. It's probably an unsatisfying answer, but that's the way that I think about it.
Do we have another question? Okay.
We know that with certain investments, we can get some assurance that they're in good alignment with Catholic moral values. Can we or should we ask the question, if I invest in Bitcoin, how well aligned is that with Catholic moral values? Is that a sensible question or not?
give to Satoshi what is Satoshi's, I suppose. I don't know. I actually don't think, that there's anything sort of antithetical to our, our Catholic faith in investing in Bitcoin. I really don't. I mean, I just think that it's another unit of, human interaction. I suppose if we took it down to an extreme, and there are, in the room here are, moral philosophers who are much better equipped for this type of question than I, but, there's a whole, we know that the crypto, up to this point, right, if we're just really being honest with ourselves, we know that the crypto world is sort of built on speculation. And so there's a moral component to that, right? Is that a good way to, to generate income and revenue? Again, I think it's a cop-out. What I'm about to say is a cop-out, but that doesn't make it necessarily less true. That it comes back to striking that balance, right? Am I a responsible market actor behaving in a responsible way in the market, or am I just going out there and crushing people, to make my profit? And I think that, if I were talking, there's a lot of Wall Street folks in here, I'm sure, Wall Street says, well, of course that's what you do. You crush people and make your profits, right? So I would only think about it that way. As an asset class, I don't think that there's anything, particularly immoral about Bitcoin, any more than I think that there's anything particularly immoral about, a gold coin, right? But how it's used, I think, is where we start to introduce these moral dimensions that need to be explored. And it's really about markets and less about the asset, is how I would kind of look at that. Again, very unsatisfying, but these are good and deep questions.
All right, with that, we are out of time. I want to thank Patrick Campos, and thank you.